I just think
I
that
tell this
people
whole
were not.
I'm sorry. That just my dad right now. Just happened. No, he fell.
Barely see her.
Yeah, so sorry. So doing a lot of stuff, but we are winning it away. This should actually should be a big thing. Yep. All right, friends. folks. Hey, good morning, Mr. Brown. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Schwartz.
Good morning.
Good morning, Ms. Holmes. I'm just going to say good morning to everybody. Good, good morning, Ms. Andrews. Good morning, Dr. Shank.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mrs. Woods. Good morning, Ms. Wetstein.
Good morning.
Good morning, Ms. Atwood. Good morning, Mr. What's your name? Let's call you Ridgway.
I thought it was Dr. Ridgway. I got promoted.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Good morning, Danielle. Okay, it is 9 o'clock, and this morning is June 4th, 2024. To view the live stream video of this meeting, please go to the Lewis Palmer School District 38 YouTube page. Miss Wood, would you please take the roll?
Here.
Here.
Here. Mr. Norris is excused absence this morning. Mr. Brown, would you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Sure.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. I hope everybody's enjoying some nice weather, and hopefully we'll get out a little bit early so you continue to enjoy some weather. Our first piece of work today is B1 legislative update with our infamous lobbyist, Amy Atwood.
Wow, what a great introduction. Amy Atwood, Atwood Public Affairs, contract lobbyist for the district. It is good to be with you this morning to review the session and discuss the impact Lewis Palmer had on the future of school funding in Colorado. Today, I will focus on how school funding evolved throughout the session and answer any questions you have on other legislation. I hope you had time to review the end of session report that was in your board packet. The session concluded on Wednesday, May 8th, so we're almost a month out, and saw the introduction of 778 bills. Of those, 525 passed, 180 failed, and I tracked and monitored 55 of those specifically for Lewis Palmer. We consider this session the bookend to the year, with the new year beginning in July. That is the time when stakeholder meetings commence, bills are drafted, and interim committees and task force start their hearings. So we'll start that for the 25 session next month. First and foremost, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude for your unwavering support and the opportunity this year to represent the district. Working on the district priority proactive bill, Senate Bill 17, distribution of state share of district total program, was a privilege. Under the guidance of Mr. Ridgway and in consultation with the Governor's Office of the Governor's Office of Budget and Planning, as well as other stakeholder groups, this bill, as you know, passed with near unanimous support. Every student, as we were saying, and school district will benefit from this. The theme of this session in education was undoubtedly school funding in both the short term and the long term. For years, the topic of school funding has been a major concern for lawmakers and education advocates in Colorado. The school funding system, if you don't know, was established in 1994 and has largely been unchanged since the passage of Amendment 23 nearly 25 years ago. It's only seen minor adjustments nibbling around the edges. A number of years ago, the legislature formed the School Finance Interim Committee, which worked for years and years to rewrite the school finance formula. But unfortunately, they were unsuccessful. It's worth noting that interim committee members are legislators. They're not subject matter experts. I tracked the work of this committee throughout its duration, and so did Mr. Ridgway. After several years of limited success by the interim committee, the legislature took action last year to establish a school finance task force. The task force consisted of subject matter experts in school finance, superintendents, CFOs, community representatives, and education stakeholder groups and associations. Their charge was to find consensus built around recommendations for a new school finance formula. The task force recommendations were available to the legislature before the session started in January. And that's important to remember when we get further on. Many of the recommendations had consensus, but not all did. So there was a minority report as well. I tracked and reported on this task force each time I presented to you last year. If all of the recommendations were implemented, the state would have to find more than $1 billion to do so. The likelihood of the task force recommendations, all of them, or really any of them, making it across the finish line when session began was slim, like the proposals the interim committee brought forward each year before them. The stalemate was broken this year with the passage of 3 bills, each accomplishing a significant step forward for school funding. First, the passage of Senate Bill 188. That's the School Finance Act for 24-25, so the year we're going into. It does not include the budget stabilization factor for the first time in over a decade. Second, the passage of 1448, the reform of the school finance formula. So this is the one you heard a lot about, the new school finance formula bill, to direct more money to at-risk English language learners and special education students and increase overall spending by $571 million in the next 5 years. And thirdly, the passage of Senate Bill 233. And you may not have heard or connected this with education, but it creates a 2-tier property tax system that protects school district revenues, even as new limits will be placed on tax revenue for all local governments. Legislative leaders and education advocates acknowledge that the bills only fix some funding problems and not all. First, the reforms do not address adequacy of school funding. That's whether schools are spending enough to accomplish goals like certain levels of student achievement. These bills are to establish equity in school funding. 2 studies commissioned in 2023, in the 2023 legislature, are looking at the adequacy issue for next year, and they'll report back for next session. So it's interesting to keep in mind there is the distinction between adequacy and equity, and that was a major talking point, and very relevant talking point for the reforms that then did pass. Second, it is impossible to guarantee that the reforms are financially sustainable. Legislative sponsors have repeatedly stressed they have structured their bills to ensure the budget stabilization factor will never have to be invoked again, but it was not repealed. There is no guarantee that a recession, future law changes, restrictive ballot measures, property tax measures, or other unforeseen circumstances will not pose new challenges. I'm going to get into a little bit of the weeds, and Ms. Ridgway may have already shared this with you. So let's start with the first bill, which is the 24-25 School Finance Act.
Sally,
Yes.
before you dive into the weeds, Mr. Ridgway never does that here. May I ask a couple questions?
Sure.
Because they're macro questions. Concern you're diving into the micro. I want to, at least for likely the balance of the board and maybe just myself, make sure we've got a crisp understanding of what the legislator was attempting to accomplish with some of these passages. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So my first question is, you spoke about equity and adequacy. How does the legislature or the governor define those? What does equity look like if it's successful, and what does adequate mean?
That's a really good question.
Answer me.
We'll start with adequacy. Do we have enough money? And the vast majority of people who are in and around education feel that there needs to be more money in K-12 education. The recommendations from the task force said over $1 billion. That's something that we've heard for years, is that each year we're $1 billion short. How we get to that through local and state is the mix that they're trying to work on, and that passing their own mill levies go towards. So adequacy, do we have enough money for student achievement and to do what we believe needs to be done?
Following question.
Equity. Or do you want me to answer equity?
Can I ask a following question there? Because I think it might be relevant to what you just said. And this has nothing to do with my personal views on it. This has to do more with the public. So the New York City school system, which is either the first or second largest K-12 system in the country, averages somewhere in the range of 19,000 PPOR. The Anchorage school system, I think, is in the 14,500 to 15,000 range. Los Angeles and Chicago are not too far behind. Their performance is in the bottom 5 to 10% of the country on a pretty much perennial basis. What was the legislature's thought in terms of balancing number of dollars versus results?
Well, we're going to get into that, actually.
Or the weeds?
Yes. And actually, that was Mr. Ridgway's concern, and expressed that to legislators, the House Education Committee, as how do you tie this new money coming in to outcomes? Like SPED has measurable outcomes and measurable where at-risk and ELL don't. And there is an accountability task force that will be meeting this year, and that's where that discussion will happen. So you're correct.
Okay. Thank you for allowing me to.
Yeah.
Is this helpful for everybody else, or is it just me?
Okay. And then can I answer the equity piece?
We would love that.
Okay. So on the equity here's our pot of money. How does it get distributed equitably and with those different populations? So you have your base, and then how much more should it be for ELL? How much more should it be for at-risk, for special education, for rural? And then those all stack on top of each other. And with the new formula, they feel that it is more equitable in that regard for the hard-to-serve populations.
Were the hard-to-serve populations less, they were perceived as being underserved financially, obviously, right?
Yep.
Why?
Be-
Is there a direct dollar correlation? Does the underserved community receive less dollars per pupil than the well-served population in the state?
Do you want to answer that?
So, no, they don't receive less dollars. It's
What drives this paradigm?
the conclusion that is jumped to is because the educational results aren't the same for the underserved community, then there must be a resource issue. And that's part of the accountability that still needs to come into the middle to make sure that they can do things that students in these underserved groups need, and that will provide the result of a better educational experience for them instead of just more money for the same result.
Because in large cities, that doesn't
Right.
necessarily yield results our society would like to see.
Right, and the whole term equity, of course, was co-opted a little bit and became very synonymous with underserved communities, with economic and demographic challenges. But when it comes to School Finance Act, equity is more financially defined. It's more objectively defined, and there are other things like rural and metro proximity that were factors in equity as well. And so they're not a a sociologically or societal definition of equity, but it's really more of a mathematical definition of equity. And I've been saying for years that the path to adequacy goes through equity, and it's not through equity of underserved populations, it's through equity of the geography of the state. And so that was really, I think, some of the progress that was made this year, is because they did put down the adequacy arguments for a while and focus on the equity. And I think really importantly, focused on the rural parts of the state, where it's more of a cost of business conversation than whether a population is served or underserved. Because going out into the fringes of the state in those really rural remote areas, the old assumption was that a community would grow their own, and they'd grow their own teachers. But that doesn't happen anymore. And so now what you need to do to get teachers to go to Burlington is you got to pay them more. And the old model said you paid them less, right? And so we really had to change that and introduce this proximity funding factor that would change that dynamic and say, now we can pay people to leave the city and go to the country to teach. And that's completely opposite. And so that's where some real progress has been made, I believe, and if we can see that start to generate some success, then the adequacy argument will be still not an easy argument, but a much clearer argument once we feel that once we know that the equity angles are covered. So that's quite of a tangent that I went on.
Told you he doesn't get no.
Yeah.
On.
So I forgot the original question.
The original question was, how do you feel about things, Brett?
Okay. That's all I need is an open end. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just seeking to understand the why behind all these actions, if that's okay with the team here. And I know it's taking an extra 5 minutes. So what do we get if it works?
Can you repeat your question? I didn't hear it.
What do we get if it works? What do we, the citizens of Colorado, get if this paradigm, this formula, this methodology works?
I would say that the education advocates and the legislators say better performance.
Okay, and what does performance mean? Higher test scores, less people going to jail after high school? What are we measuring?
They didn't go into that.
Do
Because
they know?
that's the adequacy and performance side.
Mm-hmm.
So those things, while they were discussed about raising student performance, those metrics are to come later
Okay.
with the accountability task forces.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is it fair that as tax-paying citizens who care about our next generation, is it fair for us to hold the accountability task force accountable to putting metrics in place that ensure their wonderful returns from these incremental dollars that are going into our system?
I think that is a reasonable expectation.
Okay.
I think that's the exact angle actually to play, because it really works to both sides of the aisle. You know, the right may want to make sure that we're having an efficient return on investment, and the left wants to make sure that the student experience outcomes are better.
Right.
Those both can be achieved with having good performance metrics in the middle and measuring
Exactly.
what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah. Every morning we do this, we pledge allegiance to the flag. I don't see any aisles in that flag.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to add one observation that I've noticed too, when there's the discussion and the debate of what does the formula look like in Colorado. And in Colorado, where our funding, to your point, Mr. Schwartz, you look at big metropolitan areas such as New York, where the money that's being spent on per pupil revenue isn't being reflected in outcome. But there's also a point where, so money does not necessarily equate to better outcome students. At the other side of the spectrum, if it's too low, then that can equate to struggles with
Yeah, what you
outcomes and
pay for.
achievement. So where's that sweet spot of spending enough efficiently to make sure that we are serving our students but not spending too much just to throw money at a problem or an issue that's not being solved. So finding that sweet spot. And I will take special education as a perfect example, where we still serve our students that are in that spectrum and have that need, but that comes out of the general fund because it's an underfunded mandate. And we do it because it's the right thing to do, and we do it because it's mandated, but we don't have the dollars to support it. And that's something that the legislature, I'm sure you're going to get into that, here in Colorado addressed. It's not something that's been addressed yet federally, and it is a federal mandate. So that's just an example of finding that place where you're serving, you're not throwing money away, and you're not underfunding. You're finding that spot that serves all of our students the right way.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of factors, right? Also, there's different costs of doing business in Manhattan than in Monument, right? Okay, thank you.
Okay. So the little weeds is really only a sentence. When we look at the 24-25 funding, and those are the numbers you built your budget on, base per pupil funding went up $419. So that is a significant amount for base per pupil to go up next year, and the budget stabilization factor was totally bought down. That was a very big selling point this year. The legislature, if you remember, made that commitment going into this session. The governor made that commitment as well. I think it might have been premature, looking at how the budget did shake out in the end, but it sets up the idea that because it's been bought down, are you going to do it again and balance the state budget on the back of K-12 education? So for that to happen again, that is a big decision for the legislature and every legislator. Okay, let's move on to the new school finance formula. And most discussions concern this bill, 1448. The outline of the bill, with many but not all of the task force recommendations, was released by Speaker McCluskey in March. It didn't surprise us that it was coming. We knew that it was coming. And it did not have all of the recommendations because if you remember, it would be $1 billion to implement. So I just want to go through the process of how it passed. So I shared the outline with Mr. Ridgway and received feedback on the foreseeable impacts to Lewis Palmer. I shared that feedback with Speaker McCluskey directly. We had about a 40-minute phone call. And I remember I was sitting in the parking lot in my car, and it was 5:30. I thought, this is great. She said, I'm headed to a meeting that's about 40 minutes away. Can we talk? And so that's when we really had the in-depth conversation about the measurables, the accountability that goes with the new money, and the equity versus adequacy conversation. And she understood it. We weren't the first people to say it. She really respects Mr. Ridgway, and his opinion about the formula was really, really important to her. So, took our concerns, okay. And there is an accountability task force, like I said, that will be meeting this year, and we'll get engaged with that as well. It really starts to ramp up this year, and we do expect the legislature next year that instead of school funding, it's going to be accountability. Each step of the way, each committee hearing and floor vote was counted. As we passed through the first committee hearing, momentum started to build. Mr. Ridgway testified in that first committee. I think you were there for 10 hours?
It was, we lost track after a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Waiting to speak, but it was definitely worthwhile because he could be so concise about what that issue is, where some other people danced around it, but he really was concise and able to put it out there in an understandable format. Passage was not certain, as there was strong opposition from wealthier districts, CEA, and some stakeholder groups, those with the minority report. All of those groups, though, either moved to neutral or support before the final vote was taken in the Senate.
Why?
Well,
What do you think about it?
there were what, a couple dozen amendments that got put on.
Oh, yes, there were
So
amendment after amendment after amendment. There was a study, two studies that were put in that were being framed as backpack funding studies that would had a outcome, so the study already had an outcome. CEA specifically wanted that removed. There is a plus up. There were 5 districts that were considered losing money in the formula because of student averaging, the number averaging over a 5-year period instead of a 6-year period. So there is a plus up. And that is what got Douglas County on board. That was their major ask. And there was a mill levy override task force that was added at the end, and that was from education stakeholder groups to really look at the bill that we passed a couple years ago to figure or really understand that. I think now.
That's the minimum mill bill.
no, that has to do with the program mill of the School Finance Act is what you're referring to. This is mill levy override matching.
Oh, so the state,
Yeah,
some skin in the game if
Yeah.
the community does something.
yeah, yeah.
So those were major amendments, as well as Boulder Valley, BVSD, and Boulder, both, and Cherry Creek actually, are very, very worried about the sustainability of the new formula, and so triggers were put in for the Joint Budget Committee, very explicit triggers that gives them authority to move around the funding, stop the funding, stop the increases if the state budget can't handle it. Some would say it's another way for a budget stabilization factor to give those triggers to the Joint Budget Committee, but that was specific for Boulder, BVSD, Boulder, and
St. Vrain
St.
and Cherry Creek.
Cherry Creek. That was their major ask. The plus up helps too.
So initially, when the bill was introduced, or when we heard more of the conversation, that's when we were getting the early indications that we were going to be a quote unquote loser in that, and then in those early versions we were. I think what's really good about the work that transpired is we stayed patient with it and let them work through that. The new formula is simplified from the older version, but still has enough complexity to it that enough variables could be adjusted and fine-tuned to find the right balance. And so that really helped us in particular move to a good place where our funding would not be harmed, would not stay flat even. It may not grow as much as others, but that's really as much as we are going to be able to hope for in this until we got to that point. And Speaker McCluskey really did, I think, a fabulous job in nuancing and finding that path, really threading the needle with a very precise answer that solved almost all of the big questions and left it with a place that everyone could say, yeah, this is better than what we have, so let's move forward with it.
And that's likely something we should be respectful of. We see on a national basis how hard that particular thing is to do.
Mm-hmm.
And to follow on from that, Speaker McCluskey was very appreciative of the respectful way that we brought concerns to her, that specifically Lewis Palmer brought concerns. It was not a hair on fire. It wasn't, I'm going to kill your bill. It was, how do we do this? Here are some solutions. Mm-hmm. And by being patient and working together, that also has built Lewis Palmer's reputation. And that was, besides we had Senate Bill 17, besides that, if we go back to the original discussions about having a lobbyist directly, was to have more influence with the legislature, and we absolutely did that. We knew that was 17, but we also did it here with the new school finance formula. And a simple way to say what the bill does, it reorders and adjusts the weights of factors like ELL, special education, cost of living, and remoteness. So it is a student-weighted formula, and it, like Mr. Ridgway said,
We're first name basis.
we are. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever called you Mr. Ridgway.
Yeah.
That's what it does. Creates the mill levy override working group to meet during the 24 interim this summer to make recommendations modifying the override mill levy match concerning which eligible districts and eligible institute charter schools will receive a distribution. So they're really going to dive into it. And I've been working with the sponsors so that Brett has a place on that. We were assured that before passage, but just always have to make sure that you keep the pressure on. Mm-hmm. Let's see. The bill actually, they were not called triggers for the JBC, they were called circuit breakers. So that was the, that was,
Tripwires.
right, exactly. That was what it was called, and that's for adverse economic and revenue conditions. Okay, now lastly, the legislature introduced property tax bill, they introduced one property tax bill on Monday, so 3 days before the legislature closed. This bill was not only an education finance bill, but it also intended to control the growth of property taxes. Sponsors wanted to protect local school revenues, which have proliferated in the last couple of years and made retirement of the BS factor a possibility, at least for now. The bill was born out of recommendations from the Property Tax Task Force created last year. So much like we had for the School Finance Task Force, these were subject matter experts put together, not legislators, to really look at this. There might have been 2 or 4 legislators on it, but it was a big group with a lot of input. And they were to have their recommendations brought forward in March, and I think they came forward in April, and the bill has some of the recommendations, not all of them. But starting next year, the bill creates 2 assessed values for each residential property, a slightly higher one for mill levies assessed by school districts, and another for all local government entities. That's including your fire, any local government. The bill includes a hold harmless payment of $351 million to school districts for 24-25 to account for the loss of local revenues. There are smaller hold harmless payments going forward. I say next year this is what's going to happen, but voters this fall will likely see ballot measures. We will definitely see ballot measures that further reduce property taxes, and those do not have a carve-out for mill levies assessed by school districts. There are a number of ballot measures that are out for circulation, meaning out for signature, and we won't know what is on the ballot, definitely on the ballot, until the signatures are due mid-August. So usually after Labor Day is when we know, because Secretary of State has to cure not the ballots, cure the petitions. So we'll see what is on the ballot, and that could be a real threat.
So is this, if I may, is this conceptually similar to HH? Whereas the legislature did not pass a law, but they proposed something that will go on the ballot.
No. Okay, that's a really good question. So this bill is not one that we will vote on. The things we'll vote on are coming up from different stakeholder groups, privately brought forward. This one, however, If any of those pass, this will not be implemented. That was part of the
So
bill.
this is subordinate to something the electorate
Yeah.
would pass?
Yes.
Was this bill passed?
Yes.
Okay.
And it was
Sure.
near unanimous. I think it had like 5 no votes.
Was there a limit on net tax increase similar to Prop 13 in California?
I don't believe this one had that in place, no.
Thank you.
Okay. So I've talked a long time.
No,
Do you
it's
have
good.
any other questions about other bills or?
I have a question as it relates to that one. We are not yet up to, Lewis Palmer School District is not yet up to our required mills yet. What are we at?
We're going to take our final step towards that in this next mill setting in December. We're at 26.164, and so next December we'll go to 27 even, and that will be our final landing place for that.
And I don't know when that was put in place, that school districts are required to be at 27 mills minimum, right? Is that what it is?
Yes, 27 mills minimum, or and again, this, if you recall earlier conversations, our taxes are in 3 pieces, right? We have our bond levies, we have our override levies, and we have the School Finance Act levy. So we're talking only about the School Finance Act levy.
Yeah.
And so the legislature put in place that districts had to be either at 27 or at the place they were at when they detabered, whichever one was lower. And so it's the combination of that and the growth in local share that have really allowed these improvements in school funding these last 2 years to happen. It's what has allowed the budget stabilization factor to go away, because it took some of that pressure that had been building for those 10 plus years on the state's budget, and we're able to distribute it and share it a little better with the local community. Because one of the things that we've been talking about in education all the years, we kept saying, well, we're $1 billion short, we're $1 billion short. That $1 billion was from local share, from local property taxes, not from the state budget, right? And so that was the uncomfortable conversation that we had to have, and why they put in some of these qualifications into this is say, well, we've been talking about this and we knew this for years, that we needed to improve the local contribution to education. And so if we're going to take things, we being Colorado, if we were going to take things and now start working on property tax limits, that was going to be completely counter to what we've been saying and what we needed to change in terms of education funding, where we need to increase local contributions. So I really appreciate that was recognized as an important thing to really separate that out and say, well, we need to work on property tax relief, but not as it impacts education, as it impacts other items.
You answered my next question.
Okay.
Before we move on, Mr. Brown, any questions or thoughts? Mr. Schwartz?
No, thank you.
Dr. Shank? No? Okay. Please continue.
Well, that is the end of my presentation. Thanks for asking so many questions. We got to skip a couple pages. And
I'm sure it was a net loss.
it really, I meant what I said. It's a privilege and it was an honor to work on Senate Bill 17, as well as being in these conversations with the speaker. She came specifically to Lewis Palmer asking, what does Brett think of this? What does he think of these numbers? And keep in mind, Senator Lundin was the Senate sponsor. And so we had a direct meeting with Senator Lundin about the concerns and what the bill really did and the impacts of that. So highly engaged throughout the process on that one.
A direct meeting and many string questions too.
Okay, thank you so much.
I have one question,
Yes.
though, so some of these that did pass have some timelines on when school districts are expected to comply, and or some of it doesn't really affect us, some do. I'm always curious, how do they come up with the timeline of when we were expected to do what we're expected, the mandates, when we're expected to, and some of them are unfunded mandates, by the way, that still come out of our general fund. Was there anything, in your opinion, that passed that will affect our general budget negatively or positively? Obviously, some of them we know about 17, but are there any that are going to affect us negatively?
You know, looking at the major bills, I don't think so. Looking at what we really focused on, that no, I don't believe so.
Okay.
And back to your original question or the beginning where you said, how is that determined? So the first step is always, when can CDE implement it themselves if there's a CDE component to it? So that's the first date that they start with. Doesn't mean they stick with it, but they start with that date first. And then come to school districts, case is often asked, how long do you need to implement this? And we will see that specifically in the accountability bills that come forward, is what is the ramp, what's the runway for these? So that it's a very relevant question specifically going into next session.
And something that I think that we as a board can keep all of this in mind is, with the partnerships and the networking and the hard work that Brett and Amy have put together, going into, for example, the CASB, the Colorado Association of School Boards delegate assembly, resolutions will be coming up due when we launch back into school. Resolutions will become due in September. So making sure that, is there anything we as a district, that's a conversation we can have following up with this, maybe at our work session. What can we do to help support the efforts that you guys are doing going forward? And I'll give an example. We've always had our resolutions that we've pounded on of local control. And those resolutions, we don't have to necessarily bring those as specific singled out resolutions this year, because we, as Lewis Palmer School District, got CASB to implement that wording into the standing resolutions now. So we can work on other things. We worked on eliminating the budget stabilization and really wanted to make sure that we were piggybacking on what was important for you guys and your efforts. So we had the CASB Legislative Resolutions Committee have a unanimous position of support for 17. So working together in tandem to support your efforts, that's a conversation that I think we can continue to have, especially going into the next session after this election.
Those relationships are really important with the associations, but also with different school district lobbyists and legislators. Like a specific example was on Senate Bill 17. Senator Marchman she's up in the Boulder area, or not Boulder, Poudre area, and was just struggling to really comprehend what Senate Bill 17 did, that it really was as simple as it sounded. And that was, her school districts were struggling. So we amended the bill, well, not we, the legislators amended the bill to say that a school district could opt out of doing this. So once the bill really looked like it was going to pass, then school districts started to really look at the bill and figure out, oh yeah, this is something we want to do. It had to do with like how much loan, what the loan options are with the state. And they were okay with CDE asked that, okay, if a district doesn't want to do this, that it's an opt-out, not an opt-in. So every school district right out of the chute will be opted into the 9 payments, but a district can ask to not be included in that. And that was a good coming together of, sure, I mean, I guess if that's what you want, but CDE needed on the implementation side not to be trying to chase down all the school districts.
Yeah, and that was a conversation that we were having in committee as well. And because we push so hard, not just us, but that networking and that united front of local control is what we hear from the majority of school districts. That is one of the number one things that is brought up in discussion that I've seen change just since I've been in this role. And local control was the question that kept getting brought up, was what if we don't want to? I'm like, I don't know why you wouldn't want to,
Right.
but if you don't want to, you don't have to.
Right, and it supported the values of Lewis Palmer to go that direction.
Yeah, and thank you both for the work that you put into that.
And lastly, I'll close with, we have 100 legislators. They all are also politicians. So, and it's a different skill set to be a politician versus a policymaker. And being a policymaker isn't what gets you elected. And so not all 100 are policymakers. And when we have these technical bills, like the state share payments, School Finance Act, we're working with people that this is their first exposure to it. And we had 30% of the legislature were new legislators. So that meant new on the education committees. And so there is a lot of education that had to happen last year. We are losing one of our biggest supporters in Senator Zenzinger. She's term limited. And we've cultivated other relationships. Actually, Senator Marchman is one of them, because again, the respectful way we came to her and came to her school districts. Brett made phone calls to them directly to really talk it through with them. So I think when you keep that in mind, it's policy versus kind of sales and a politician. Okay, great. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
May I make one other comment? So just to jump on what Subcher said, the combination of Amy and Brett's been invaluable to our 6,500 student district in an ocean of 780,000 students in the state. So we now have disproportionate leverage at the state level, which is everything our constituents asked us to do. Go fight these battles at the state level. Don't keep asking me for money. So we have several glaring examples of success in this area. So we're grateful to what you as a team were able to do and the fortitude you showed to not give up and drive this all the way across the goal line. Thank you.
And that influence that Brett has is not just with legislators, it's also with staff, with Joint Budget Committee staff, where they will reach out to him directly and ask if they could check their numbers, if he could check their numbers. So that is the kind of influence.
100%.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Amy. That was really good information, really good. Okay, let's move on to B2, policy review. Amber Wetstein is going to introduce policies AC and IMDB and KHC-R.
Yes, good morning. My intention this morning is to give you an update on the work that we're currently doing and planning to bring forward at future meetings. We recently reviewed AC, and we learned just last week that there are newly approved regulations to Title IX that are required for school districts to incorporate within AC in a very timely manner, as of July 1 to be precise, which no one will be able to do. So in that regard, we are working with CASB along with our legal counsel, who is planning to develop a suite of policies in alignment with the new requirements, and we are hoping to bring those forward for a first read in August. So myself, along with Mr. Frampton and Mrs. Welch, are working on those alongside our legal counsel currently. So we'll be bringing those forward to you.
Isn't Ms. Welsh at some kind of a symposium for that right now?
Both of them are currently at a Title IX conference this week, so that is why they are absent today.
Are there some significant highlights that are worth us understanding at this early date?
It's going to be substantial, so I'm not able to speak thoroughly about those today. But we will give you a thorough presentation with all of those changes.
And this is, I suspect, an unfunded mandate versus a funded?
This is about non-discrimination and Title IX requirements, much of which will align with the work of the consent task force that occurred last summer along policy lines, but we were really waiting for this this legislation and the regulations to be finalized before bringing those forward. Brett, do you want to
I
chime in?
just would say, yeah, there's no funding tied to this.
Correct.
But I also don't believe there's heavily
Correct.
burdensome work to be done either. It's just a change in tactic and approach.
Understood. Thank you, guys.
Okay, we also reviewed IMDB, which is regarding flag displays, and it is primarily regarding the display of the United States and Colorado flags. And we also reviewed with our legal counsel this policy, and we are not recommending any changes. I would recommend that we bring this forward at the June 17th meeting as a formal review, so that we can cite that we did review this policy and are not recommending any changes at this time. And then finally, we are working again with our legal counsel, and I was speaking with our attorney related to this policy both Friday and a follow-up yesterday. LBD-R, which is the regulation related to displaying non-curricular materials in classrooms, and there is a potential addition that we may bring forward within the regulation at the June 17th meeting. Regulations are typically not something that the board votes on, but we may provide some clarification within that regulation related to the importance of displays within classrooms relating to education priorities and the curriculum being taught. I'm happy to answer any questions you have, but we will specify those changes when we bring these forward, both June 17th and then likely August for AC.
Any thoughts or discussion on these three items? What I would add is when you read through the policies as they stand now, they're pretty strong policies actually. It could just be a matter of making sure that we are, as a district and individuals, aware of what the policy states and through training.
Yes, and that's something we've discussed as an administrative team, is reviewing these policies with principals at the beginning of next school year to make sure that we are consistent in how we're carrying out these policies within our schools and classrooms.
Any work session discussion? No? Well, okay. Then we will see, stay tuned, I guess, right? Okay. B3, facility usage update. Brett and Melissa are going to present information regarding district building and program capacity, as well as our current utilization of facilities. I'm actually looking very forward to this one. Thank you so much.
Sure. And so just background for folks, I think one of the things one of the reasons this came up is we have our monthly enrollment reports that get posted and as part of the board packets. And the data there's a column in there that talks about what is the capacity of each building. And that data became quite stale. And really, it's not something we were ever looking at. Mostly, we're always looking at where are our students at. And so it was brought to our attention by a member of the public about the capacity numbers that were being shown in there and how they were inconsistent with some of the talking points that we were expressing about whether buildings were at capacity or over capacity and such. And so we wanted to press into this and update those numbers, but also then talk about some of the decisions that we make and how those affect these numbers. So I will hand it to Melissa then to go through these slides, and you can tell me where to click.
Okay. So you've seen a bunch of this presentation before. I've copied a lot of the previous presentation, and as I'm trying to really wrap my mind around how things were done with calculations, And so looking at the first one, we're talking about capacity and what ends up happening when we are under capacity. And as it was stated before, sometimes the facilities need to be looked at something for repurposing the facilities or being removed from the inventory. When we're underutilized, we also start reducing the opportunities to offer robust programs for our students, for specials or electives or things like that. And so then on the other end of that, overutilization, when we're above capacity, sometimes that's not the best educational environment for learning. One of the options that was listed before was to redistrict or to adjust boundaries. And so if we get to any of these situations, I would like to propose that we look at something in between the two of them, where maybe a boundary adjustment is necessary in the event of a brand new development that comes in, so we can get ahead of the development, move a boundary that makes sense to push them into a location where there's space for students. Or on the other end, if they're existing kids, a lot of times we can deal with that with choice, providing opportunities. Sometimes it's a programming thing, and instead of providing the exact same educational opportunity at every school, it might be worth considering having different educational opportunities where kids are making a specific choice to attend a STEM program over an IB program, to try to help alleviate that without having to put pressure on families with boundary changes. Just some ideas. When we're looking at capacity, it is really how many students a building can serve, but it depends on who you're asking on what that looks like. It is a complicated answer. Our educators are going to tell you something different. Our architects, the fire department, everybody's going to have a different idea of what that capacity is. And so just a few of the basics, the design capacity is as we sit down early on and design a school, a lot of times we'll align it with a feeder system or something when we're trying to design that school, but ours are old, and so the use of those buildings has changed over time. When we're looking at the fire capacity, then we're really looking at a square footage calculation and the egress from a building. That's not necessarily specific for education, so when we say the fire code, we can put 75 kids into a classroom space, that's not great for effective education, so we have to do an education capacity. The board recommended capacity. How many kids per teacher are you looking at, are your recommendations? And then our teachers and principals can go in there and figure out how many classrooms, how many teachers, and what are those class sizes. And then we have the functional or program capacity. And so what we're looking at is what is currently being delivered in that space. A space that may once have been a 25-student classroom for a math class may now be used for special education, where we can only put 3 high needs with paras and teachers. And so we're utilizing that space much differently. I think the other thing that's really important, it's highlighted in red at the bottom, is we're using or educating students differently now. We need more space for the type of education that we're doing. It is not always just sitting down in the classroom. A lot of times we now have activities, collaboration, maker spaces, things like that. So we are decreasing the number of students per space based on the type of activity and learning that they're doing. So it is industry standard, looking at the design capacity. I want to make sure that we're on the same page as another district on what that means. When we're looking at an elementary school, it is based on their homeroom. So if we have a school and we have 4 first grade classrooms at 25 kids per piece, that is 100 students per grade. So in a K-6 building, that building is 700 students. Specials and electives are not included in the calculation.
Huh.
So
Yeah, but none of our elementary schools other than Bear Creek.
that was just an example.
Okay.
Yeah, it could be rounds of 3, it could be rounds of 2. It really just depends on what our educational perspective is, but that was a demonstration on how that is done. Yes.
So it says K-6 building. So for example, with our schools, having 6th graders in our schools, where we're supposed to be offering more opportunities as they transition into 7, 8, how's having a 6th grade change that, or does it not?
Or do you calculate it any differently?
It is calculated differently, so then we have to figure out what educational programs can we offer and how can we get creative of providing it in a space it wasn't designed to be. So when we do that and we have more specials or electives and we don't have the space, we can either do additions, we can do things where during during specials, when the kids are out of a classroom space, does art come in instead of going to an art room? And it's not ideal, but those buildings weren't built to house the programs the way we're currently delivering them. And so that's where our creativity has to come into play. The capacity doesn't change at that building. It's just utilizing the special education, the specials spaces differently.
So an example would be, we don't have it currently, but when we had band, when we had to arrange band class around lunchtimes because it's being used, and the cafeteria is being used as band, and then everything gets shoved in a corner while kids are eating. That would be an example.
Yes, so the capacity of the building is still the same.
Gotcha.
The use of the space becomes more complicated.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks.
Yes. Same thing with middle and high school. Those are based on our core classes, our math, science, social studies, and English. So you take as example a team at the middle school level, a silver team. They have 25 kids per one of those 4 classes. That team of 100 says you've got a team of 100 6th graders, 7th graders, a team of 100 8th graders. So if we did that, it's based again on those core classes, not on the elective spaces. And then we just rotate them through the building. So that impacts our utilization. So when we're looking at a school building and we have a traditional classroom, a math class, and they are occupied 8 hours, 6 class periods a day, and 2 are vacant, that classroom is not being utilized, so we're getting a lower utilization because the teacher's office is often in that space. So when we start looking at overcapacity, then we start making some decisions. Is that teacher going to continue to own that space, or are we going to have that teacher come out and put in a Spanish teacher or something to be educating so the utilization comes up? It's not ideal, but there are other options to try to utilize space at a higher rate.
So I suspect you're going to get here, so just push me off to whenever you get there.
Okay.
The question is twofold. Onefold, is there some kind of a percentage factor that is applied to this core academic metric or standard to account for what Ms. Upchurch gave a wonderful example for specials and electives? And then secondly, is there somewhere in this, we're going to review what the utilization sweet spot looks like?
Yeah, and if we want to move to next slide.
Did I tee that up well?
I mean, I'm not sure I'm going to answer it to the T to completely satisfy you, but we'll start with this. The maximum capacity is what would look like if we occupied that classroom space 100% of the day. And so if we had 25 kids in those 2 classrooms, 8 hours a day, that is 400 students a day that pass through those classrooms. That's 100% utilization. Most often, that's not realistic. And so what we're looking at is a utilization factor. Typically, what we see in elementary schools is 90% utilization, and we consider that very good utilization. Middle and high schools, 75 to 85% is typical. When we get into crisis mode, we get overcrowded, then we start utilizing that space differently. We have those conversations about, can we move teachers around? Can we move classes in? But that's not ideal. Unless we do have some space, which I've noticed in this district, we have some pods where space for teachers' desks, and so those classrooms do not have to be vacant. The teachers have a place to go. They don't have to be sitting in that classroom, so we can figure out how to utilize that space differently. The next slide is one that you saw previously. I have not adjusted anything in this. It is basically the age of the facility, and so we can see how education has really changed in the past 28 years or more. We didn't have to provide preschool in buildings 28 years ago. So none of our buildings would be set up, well, not none of them, but the older buildings would not be set up to house that. So then how do we do that? Do we add restrooms to buildings, make them for preschools, or do we do additions? So some of the questions on the use again. The next one is a baseline. Looks like we have a policy or baseline recommendations for, what is this? I apologize, the enrollment limits for each level. Is that correct, Brad?
Or is this the right one or not one?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this is something that we presented back in January as well, just about the Colorado Class Size Reduction Act of 2000 was a point of reference. And these are the numbers that were in that. But as Melissa's observing, like even the preschool capacity baseline here of 20 is really not a practical number for the current, where it's more like 15, I think you said, right?
Yeah, typically we see 15 or 16 student classrooms. What changes that is typically when we're looking at codes for preschool, you have to have 2 toilets to have more than 16 kids in the class. And so if we build them with adjacencies where you have a bathroom between 2 classrooms, you can increase that. But I think effective education, we're really looking at 15 and 16 kids per class. If they're half-day classes, you can have 32. Morning and afternoon class in that same classroom. It just really depends on how we're utilizing the space and what our offerings are.
If I remember, with preschool in particular, there's also some state laws on how many preschoolers per educator you can have in a classroom.
Right.
And that's preschool only. Does that apply to kindergarten, or is it just preschool? Do we know?
Do you know, Amber?
I would assume preschool.
I think it's just preschool.
Yeah. Typically, we'll see reduced numbers or larger classrooms for kindergarten. We like to build bigger classrooms because we like to provide different opportunities, carpet space versus hard floor space, so they can do their arts and crafts in there, but they can also sit and do circle time reading on the floor. So usually classrooms a little bit bigger with a lot of more movement in their education. And then the next slide was what had been done looking at the historical operating capacity, and I believe that's what Brett was alluding to in the reports that Jim has put out for enrollment. And then the study that was done that led up to the presentation in February showing what those determined capacities are and what the current enrollment was as of January. And so looking at the variance in the utilization, I think that's what you were asking about, Ron. What I would like to do is really delve into these numbers further, figure out how the calculations were done. And the stuff I've been pulling, I've seen research from other states, and I want to make sure we're keeping it a little more locally to make sure that we're abiding by our codes and requirements here as we're doing these utilization studies. I don't know what was used. I also did see some of the utilization based on the exact number of students at the time, and so that is going to fluctuate on an annual basis because we may end up having a school where we have 4 first grades, 4 second grades. That's how it was designed and had been used. But we're under population in our second grade class. We're only using 3 of those classrooms. We're tight on special education, so we throw special education into that classroom that's now housing, 10 kids. The following year, that first grade bubble pushes up in, and we need that classroom again. So it went from a classroom that was utilized at 10 kids versus the 25, and now we're back up to 25. So every year, we're going to see fluctuation in that utilization. And so getting an exact utilization of space is going to be complicated to do a thorough analysis on an annual basis. And so one of the things I would like to do to be able to update this for you and give you some good information is, as I am doing our capital walks, look at how the spaces are being utilized. We can also make recommendations to schools where they feel like they're tight on capacity and need more space or can't take more students, and look at how they're utilizing space, because sometimes we sprawl out and we turn a classroom into a book room, or we do a pull-out space in a classroom that could technically hold 25. And so we can make recommendations looking, if you need pull-out classrooms, and I see you're using 3 classrooms that could hold 75 kids, can we put up some temporary walls and give you some pull-out space so that you're not utilizing 3 classrooms, you're utilizing 1? So there's some things we can do to help the schools accommodate their needs and still provide as much other seating as possible. Yeah.
So first of all, the way you put this together is excellent. Thank you. It's very absorbable for non-educators. Secondly, is there a sweet spot in terms of utilization? In other words, we vary if we look at the far right column from 3/4 to 110%, right?
110% is really showing that we're over capacity, and truly, we should be at 9% capacity.
Well, and that kind of plays into what you were just talking about, though, of how the buildings are utilized. I mean, Prairie Winds is obviously the school that I know best because I spend the most time there. And I don't think it's a realistic number because they have classrooms, you mentioned, that they have completely unused empty classrooms,
Right.
or they've got one, I think it's a teacher's lounge or something right now.
Yeah.
So a classroom that could hold 25 more students is holding none.
Right.
So I think when we're talking about what the actual capacity is, shouldn't we be looking at it for what it could be if it were used properly rather than the way it's being used today? 'Cause
Correct.
it is nowhere near over capacity.
Right. And that's what I want to do. I want to do these walks, and I want to go through here and update this spreadsheet for you so I can speak to it. We can discuss how do we want to see this.
So-
I can make a recommendation on what I think the capacity is and why, and then we can work on how they need additional space because of pull-out groups, small group rooms, something like that. Yeah.
So, question and request.
Sure.
Question is this therefore a baseline?
This is because this is what you saw at the January meeting. This is what you've been presented before. I need to wrap my mind around how the calculations were created and make sure that it is something that we're in alignment with. It's not going to change on an annual basis. We're going to see fluctuation in utilization, but truly, I think to Todd's point, the building can probably hold more than what it is based on the way they're using it, and so we can help them be more efficient in their use.
Yeah, I could almost see the potential for 3 different capacity numbers. I mean, as being utilized today, if we just utilize all the classrooms as they were intended, and then if we were to spend a little bit of capital, rearrange some walls, make some changes, and really expand it. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to see how the buildings should really be used.
Yeah.
So maybe I work out for you.
Yeah.
That's why we have her here. So my request is, can we include Grace Best in this because it's a taxpayer asset?
Yes, yes. And what I can do is present floor plans if you would like to see them, and we can show how we feel that it could be holding core classes versus special classes, and then figure out how many kids that building could potentially hold, yes.
Yeah. And then as we develop a new base of standards, which I think where you're going, that says, what does good look like? And where's the sweet spot for K through 6 or middle or junior high and then high school, right?
And some of
Are
that
the-
may also be based on the age of the building and the building itself. We may have individual utilization differences because of the
Right.
age of the building.
So that's where I was going to go. Can we, as a team, come to some kind of foundational agreement and then allow Melissa to do the detail work that is her level of expertise that says ultimately we are trying to achieve student and staff safety, maximum academic performance, and the agility to enable our staff and students to succeed, whether it's in STEM, STEAM, specials, and or electives, right? And you give them a weight, and you correlate that into some kind of a very simple formula that has a 1 through 10 rating, and sweet spot becomes 7 through 9. Something like that. Is that reasonable?
Yep.
And does the board concur that that's something that we can take to our citizens and explain that's uncomplex but still effective?
And to your point, I think where that's also helpful to have those conversations of, are we using our space efficiently? And if we have bubbles or if we have larger numbers, the multi-million-dollar question of how are we serving our students best? So if we have a large class, and the way I understand what you just said, which I think is helpful to have a conversation about, is, okay, we've got this amount of students in 6th grade, which means, or in 7th grade or 8th grade, which means to make sure that we are meeting those core standard classes, what is being sacrificed? Is it a robotics class? Is it an art class? Is it band or whatever? When we're utilizing our space. And I will take Prairie Wind for an example. Right now, this next year, we're going to have combo classes, second and third grade combo classes for efficiency of use of space and educators. So when they made that decision, we've talked to the staff there, so I understand. But going forward, how are we knowing when decisions are being made efficiently, and how are we making sure that we are being good stewards with our taxpayers' buildings and serving our students the best that we can serve our students?
I think it would be helpful to also show the difference between different types of uses, such as core classes where kids are sitting in chairs versus a class that needs groups of students versus the uses where the utilization goes way down. And it helps our stakeholders know you may be thinking of it, where everybody was sitting in a classroom behind a desk, but that's not how it's done. So agility is really important. What's needed for that? For us to have agility, and what do we get for that agility? Well, students get better served, and maybe some examples of better serving different types of students in different situations, and how that changes the utilization. Because I don't think most people know that there's a difference between all these things.
Right.
And so they're viewing something that's 50 years old in their mind.
Yep.
And we're not doing that. So we're talking about the same thing, but we're not really talking about the same thing.
There's some
One-
things that, go ahead.
Thanks. One of the things Melissa referred to also is beginning to have us consider the concept of centers of excellence around the district. And I suspect, and I'm going to frame this as a question, we would not be the first district in the country to ever invoke the concept. That's a tried and true and tested concept. Is that a fair assumption? Sounds like Ms. Whitstein knows
I'll
this.
say many of our neighboring districts are already implementing choice-like schools, magnet-like schools, where special programs are offered at a specific site,
Right.
where there may be additional capacity, which we are currently experiencing here in Lewis Palmer,
Okay.
as far as having some additional capacity at some of our school sites.
Just one more thing I want to mention. Even if we drop the column off, that's not saying anything, but we will forever have people in the community who have the slides that say Lewis Palmer has a design capacity of LPMS has a design capacity of over 1,000 students. So we're going to have to speak to that at some point. Otherwise, they're just going to accuse us of trying to hide it.
Sure.
Because at some point, we have to explain how that got lower, and in a way that we can drop that conversation once and for all.
Right, so what I'll do is when I'm going through and doing an analysis of how the space is being used, when I'm doing my capital walks, I'll come back with a report. We can talk about how it was designed, and we may not even have had, like, the historical operating capacity may never have been right to begin with. We don't know. So we can look at the original floor plans and then see additions or modifications that have been done over time, and then how the space is being used, because you're right, a robotics class isn't going to be the same as a math class. Their change of use, which means we can't put as many kids in the space, and so some of that stuff will be easier to justify. I just need to really get in the buildings and wrap my mind around what is happening to be able to really truly answer for you.
Oh yeah, I believe it. I know that's out there because whenever the LPMS discussion comes up, everyone goes back to that design capacity number and says, well, if it could hold 1,000 kids then, why can't it now? I mean, that's a 30% reduction at most. Well, over 20% reduction.
It
So
is.
people are going to want to know,
What happened?
are we fudging that, or is there a legitimate reason that we can speak to?
Yeah, we can lay out floor plans, we can put all the core classes in one color so you can see what's core and then what specials and elective classes look like.
I mean, I totally appreciate it. But going back to the other slide, which showed the rows of students, the way it was back when we were kids versus how the classrooms are today. I mean, it definitely changes.
Right.
This one?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, that want to know if that was my classroom right there. Most of them. Never had a classroom like the one right unless it was a lab.
Different use and then different square foot requirements. So we have 20 square feet per kiddo. If we're sitting on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, we need close to 40 or 50 square feet per kid.
I get it.
Yep.
I get it, but it's just something we have to speak to because obviously the environment has changed a lot over the years.
It has, it definitely has. The other thing I would like to really focus on when we're doing these walks is space that really shouldn't be changed. A lot of times we will go through in a classroom for special education and we will reinforce the ceiling so we could put swings in there. Some of those upgrades are expensive and then we find out, oh gosh, I'm really crowded in social studies this year. I need to use that classroom. And so I'm trying to come up with some ideas, change of use form to just say, hey, we're interested in doing this and see if we can collaborate with special education team and with the principal to say, hey, this might not be the best location because we've put extra investment in that space for reinforced swings or restrooms or changing tables or things that just are specialized to a specific program. So to make sure, again, we're utilizing space as it was intended in every case that it makes sense.
Hopefully those discussions are being had before you modify the space to see if it's one that you
That's
want
why I
to
would
put
like to
back
have the
into.
form, just to make sure that we are, so just an example, sometimes the educators mean well and don't know better. And so an example is a situation I had many years ago where it was a hard surface floor science classroom, sinks, it makes a lot of sense, I need an art room. I'm pulling the kids, I'm putting art in here, but didn't say anything. So we have an acid trap, not a paint trap. And so the lower level, you saw blue streaks coming through the ceilings because the paint was seeping through because, it was kind of a mess. And so if we had that form, it's not to say, no, you can't do this. It's like, let us help you make sure you're successful.
Sounds good.
All right. So next steps. Do we need to talk about the additional considerations?
Okay.
Okay, so this is just something, just because I figured it would come up a little bit. I don't necessarily need to talk about the functional programming capacity because we just talked about that in depth. But the CTE building, we talked a little bit about the capacity of that building, and I want to make sure it's clear as we're looking at what the capacity of that potential building is much different than what a school building is, because we're not doing core classes in there. We're not doing our math, science, social studies, and English. So those classes will still be housed at the traditional high schools, and then this will be the special programming where they come in. And so depending on the space, if we're looking at classroom space where they're design drafting, sitting at a table, we might get 20 square feet per child versus the vocational, the movement, we've got the machines and that type of stuff. We're looking more at the 50. So that presentation I gave on that CTE building is why it shows that the capacity is much larger than what we would have expected considering our high schools, because of the way the building would be used and the ins and outs of the kids on a daily basis and extended use of the facility and a lot of things like that. And so next steps, initially in January was talked about getting level specific utilization index based on the current school capacity determinations. This is where I would really like to dig in, go visit these buildings and give you that update. Demographic studies to make projections on future enrollment. This is something I will do for you moving on an annual basis. We will look at all of the development that's coming in, how fast the development is turning over, how many kids that's going to generate, and that we'll have good projections going forward to see if we're going to have bubbles on an annual basis. But then we will compare that to the graphics. Will show you how it's going to compare to the capacity of each building. And then compare updated school and capacity determinations with future enrollment projections. That falls into the same thing. And I'm not sure we'll have to change the capacity just because we have different projections. We might have to do some planning on what are we going to do when we've got more kids coming in.
So from your observation, from what you've seen, and where we are now with the student enrollment we have, knowing that you still have, these are the possible next steps. Where are we sitting now with our utilization as you're walking the buildings?
Haven't started, they start tomorrow.
Okay, tomorrow.
And you have results for us by Friday?
Sure, on one.
They just won't be accurate.
Stay tuned, there's more. Okay, thanks.
What are you thinking, in all seriousness, of when we can at least have a cursory view of some findings?
So I would like to spend probably a couple months on it because I want to get all of the projections and all of the development data incorporated into it so we can really see what we're up against. And do the site walks. The site walks are more than just looking at how the space is being used. We're doing capital walks to look at every work order that needs to be done that's been overlooked, any ADA code compliance issue, just to build a new list of needs in the buildings, so that we can make sure we're taking care of the taxpayers' buildings. And so it's going to take me a little bit to pull it together. Those high schools will take at least 2 days per building to walk. So, yeah, a few weeks to walk all the buildings.
Yeah. But usually when we do those, we learn some stuff about some things we need to take care of that are wonderful customer service items, right?
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
we'll be able to do a combination of just how the building's being maintained to make sure we have adequate training to our custodians and the support and the tools that they need, in addition to big items that end-of-life HVAC systems and anything that comes up, and then we can give a good report on what our findings were on that as well.
And the value with that is knowing when we're having our budget discussions of what's coming up in the next year, we're always looking at our capital improvements and our capital needs that have gone addressed and ones that we have addressed. And I think that since Ron and I have been on this board, for example, we've found ways to tackle some of our capital improvement needs creatively, and found ways to really start I've watched this team throughout the years knock out some of that list of needs, or the honey-do list, so to speak. And so being able to go to our taxpayers also and say, here's where we are and here's what we've accomplished and here's what our needs are when we're looking at our budget. And when Brett's presenting our budget and we say, okay, we're going to need XYZ because we've got XYZ that's going to be systems that are going to fail, or we need to move a wall, or we need to be ADA compliant here. So there's so much value in that too. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So just to be clear, did I hear that you said about 2 months?
I need at least 2 months, yeah.
Okay. So is it okay if we put you on the agenda for the August work session for an update?
Sure.
Thank you.
Mr. Brown.
I just wanted to add to what you're mentioning as far as the upgrades that we may need to make to buildings. I'm hoping that we're also looking at any kind of upgrades that we can do that would improve efficiency or reduce the operating cost of some of these buildings.
Like from a utility perspective, or?
Anything that we could do
Yeah.
that makes sense. I mean,
Okay.
just a random example, if solar would help us in some way, or if there's other improvements we can make, obviously changing lighting and things like that, all these things that reduce operating expenses.
Right.
Or efficiency upgrades.
Yeah, and we've done quite a bit with the Schneider project, with LED lights everywhere and the automations and things like that. We're still trying to figure out our sweet spot of that. We end up with situations where we think a building's not going to be occupied until the thermostats are adjusted for no occupancy, and all of a sudden there's occupancy there, and so we're still working through that. But I think we are getting better. And what we're seeing then with that is our rate of increase of cost definitely moderating when it comes to utilities. Costs are still going to go up because the per unit cost is still going to go up. So yes, we'll have less units, but hopefully we can moderate that quite a bit. I think we are seeing that. We're seeing that already.
I have an offline question about that, but I'll save that for later.
One thing that was on here in our description that I wanted to bring to attention, if we can talk about that real quick, and that is
Yes.
discuss donations for turf fields at Palmer Ridge High School. And, this is something that, so what we have is a group of parents and benefactors that are involved at Palm Ridge High School that want to install artificial turf on all three fields, the football field, the baseball field, and the softball field there. That's a very generous endeavor that they are wanting to bring to us. But it is something, as I was mentioning to Tiffany, I was like, this needs board visibility and really some tacit approval, if not formal approval on this, because this does set up a need to, those fields have to be replaced in a few years, right? So we can't just blindly accept gifts. We have to think, okay, does that fit with us strategically? And so like my question to Melissa is, okay, great, well, where are we at in terms of the life cycle of the field at Lewis Palmer High School? Because what we really don't want is both fields to have to be replaced at the same time, right?
Isn't there another turf field inside the track at Palm Ridge?
I don't know. Is it a turf field
Yes.
at Palm Ridge
Yes.
already? So I don't know what the point of that, of why they're wanting to replace that.
No,
It's
no, they
not
want,
that.
it's an and, not an or. They're adding an outfield and maybe an infield to the baseball.
Right.
Baseball and softball.
Yeah, and this other turf field is in the middle of the track. It's not the baseball facility.
No, it's a football practice field, right?
Right, yeah.
The different.
Are you saying that it's already turf?
I believe so.
There is, and then, so they also have a field way back to the east that they were as the third, because they have like
Okay.
option 1, option 2, and option 3, depending on how much money that they raised to be able to implement the turf projects.
Yeah, they're not shying away from like a $3 million total bill that they would be generating completely outside of district resources. Again, that's great, but what that sets up for is a $3 million bill for us in 10 or 15 years.
At
and so I
current,
just wanted-
at present value.
At present value, right. So I just wanted to have
So-
eyes open on that.
So
Where are we on those?
future would be a little bit less because the first field that we put in has to have all under drainage and everything else. The turf replacement is usually about half the cost of the full project.
So I guess, and of course you'd be on top of him. I'm not surprised. Those was the same questions that I had when I first heard about this. Is are we going to be reducing our annual maintenance costs in a way that makes up for the long-term replacement costs that we're going to incur? Because I mean that's an amazingly generous offer, but as you mentioned, I mean we don't want to set ourselves up for a massive capital expense that we're going to have to incur somewhere down the line to maintain or replace it.
They're having drainage issues on the baseball field right now that they're unplayable in a lot of circumstances. That was one of the primary reasons why the request came in to start with. And then I do think that they were working on trying to come up with a replacement plan at the school site with parking permits and things like that. I don't know how far that money will go. What was the third part of that?
What are the current life cycle positions of the existing turf facilities we have?
10 years.
Did I say, was it 7 years in, 5 years in on that first one? at
Yes,
Summer?
6 or 7.
Yep.
I'm sorry, 6, 7 left?
Well, we're 6 or 7 in, which means we have 6 or 7 left. It's kind of right in the middle. of
So it's only a
its life cycle.
15-year life cycle?
Yeah, for turf.
Okay.
Yeah.
Especially in this environment?
In this environment, and into those football/soccer fields that do get a lot more use, wear and tear than like a baseball field does. So baseball fields and softball fields have a longer life cycle than the football.
It's more about wear and tear than elements?
Yes.
Okay.
Cleats.
Maintenance, obviously good maintenance can extend that, and we'll pursue that. But
So if you just reversed it and you ran it like a private entity and you ran a depreciation model to cover the expense of replacement at $3 million divided by 15 is what, about $180,000 a year?
And I'm not sure how much we're going to be saving on our water utility bill because we won't have.
Probably not 180,000.
No, no.
But I'm
But
curious,
if-
what is our annual maintenance cost for those fields today? And would that be offset?
Part of it would be, but part of it would still probably maintain some of the equipment and the labor, right?
Hard to say. I mean, we're not mowing it anymore. We're not watering it anymore.
I know, but you still have a lawnmower there for everything else is my point.
yeah, instead
So it's not 100%, it's maybe 50%.
right.
Can we get some kind of an estimate on what the down the road obligation is either for the boosters or the taxpayers? Because the other thing we could do is maybe we enter into an agreement And I say this because I was personally engaged in this in 2009. So the school opened in, I think, 2009. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, either 8 or 9. And myself and another neighbor had kids playing baseball, and it was already a disaster. And in general, because of where we live, those spring outdoor sports that require maintained facility, everybody here is at a disadvantage, right? And so turf begins to mitigate, does a significant job of mitigating that. I mean, you can actually snow plow stuff and it's dry and off you go, right? And that does happen here in April. So having said all that, if the boosters entered into agreement with the district, you basically would be having people agreeing to something that they would no longer be there to see through, likely. It would be a next set of boosters. So that just needs to be a consideration for the community to understand that there's a variable here that says we could agree to do this. It's $180,000 a year as an example that needs to be accrued in some form or fashion, or whatever the algorithm is based on the life cycle of the materials, and off you go, right?
Yeah, what we really like to get into is a good sequence of stacking of projects, so that a year-to-year basis, there's always kind of, $1 million that's going here or there, right? Is it for asphalt one year? Is it for turf replacement? Is it for roof replacement? And so if we have those high spend priorities really sequenced well, then it's very doable. It's when
Right, and maybe the
stacks.
district makes a contribution as well above and beyond the savings, because the board determines, or the district leadership determines, it's a good thing for the students and the community.
What I was surprised is, given the elevation of where Palmer Ridge sits, and you look across the state of Colorado at schools with that high of an elevation, I was honestly surprised that those fields are not already turfed. But it is a high ticket item up front, and we've got a donor willing to say, we'll facilitate, we'll pay for that upfront cost. And I remember having this conversation when I first got on the board, when they had to replace the turf at the football field one year and then the football field at the other school the next year, of having that discussion, and our maintenance folks saying turf is less maintenance. It's the replacement, even the replacement cost, it's that upfront investment that is the big ticket item. But you reduce a lot of the maintenance costs that go into that field, and that field is pretty much it's not usable for what it's not being utilized for its purpose. So again, it comes down to utilization efficiency.
Dead real estate.
It's just not, it can't be utilized because of it's not. So there's that too. But having that breakdown, so making sure that we are doing our due diligence, I think is, if you can provide that on top of everything else you've got going on.
So is that something we could bring for the next meeting, around a potential action item for you to?
Yeah, and just for the team here, I'm going to go right out on the edge here. I'm completely, violently in favor of doing this. Number one, you don't look a gift horse in the mouth. Number two, any time we can provide extracurricular activities that has our students doing positive things and learning teamwork and doing things that are healthy, it's a very, very good thing for everybody. And so hopefully we can figure out a way to make this reasonable, absorbable, doable, and make it part of our daily operations.
Yep. And I'm grateful for that the family that wants to come forward, that's partnership, that's community partnership.
Yeah, very much so. Very, very well said.
Anything else, Brett?
Okay, thank you. No.
I do have one question. Would it make more sense to do the presentation in September, so that way we know what our August enrollment's going to be and can have good projections to go with the presentation?
Is it time sensitive as far as the boosters and the baseball community
I was
goes?
thinking about for the other piece
She
of
skipped
it.
back.
Oh,
Sorry.
The facility utilization.
when you change channels, you have to let me know.
Or at least make
My remote control doesn't work that way.
It was working up here.
Yeah, I know you. I know.
That
Tell
makes
me-
sense.
You're supposed to look at me and say, "Tell me when you catch up," right?
Yes, let's put that on the September agenda. And the turf discussion can we have that for the June meeting? Perfect, okay.
So, question still stands. Are there some compelling events for the turf?
They want to have it in place for playability this next season, and they want both the softball and baseball. That way we don't deal with Title IX issues, and so I'm not sure when baseball season
Well,
starts.
softball's fall.
Is it fall?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, are they in a position to begin if we're in a position to move swiftly?
They say so, yes.
Okay. Then we should not be a mitigating factor here.
Okay, so just to reiterate,
It's not to a government.
turf will be on the June board meeting agenda. Asset and facility utilization, final and full report will be September board meeting.
Work session?
work
or-
session.
Or work session, sorry. Yes, September work session. Thank you. Okay. Let's move along. Thank you so very much. And to your point, I concur that it was very absorbable and understandable. So appreciate that. I'm looking forward to the next report too. Thank you, Brett, as well. Okay. Before, is this still on our agenda?
It is.
Okay.
I have a brief update on the work that we are doing to consolidate the Monument Academy Charter School contract. Essentially, we are looking to combine the two contracts that currently exist. So it's the contract for the elementary school and then the contract for the secondary school on the East Campus. And I had originally shared the draft in your executive content. I'm happy to reshare it, but it's pretty messy still. I'm working with our attorney and then have a meeting planned this afternoon with our new executive director at Monument Academy and their legal counsel to try to continue to clean up some of the language to make sure that we're not missing anything as we're consolidating two contracts into one. There are not substantial changes that we'll be bringing forward. We'll continue the same terms, so the contracts will continue on through 2028 as originally intended. There's a slight change, and Brett, I may have you speak to how funds will be distributed slightly different. And then in addition to that, we've noticed some inconsistencies in how the responsibilities for initiating expulsion of students, if that were to be required, as well as incorporating the recent special education addendums that you approved, making sure we have all of those in place within the new contract and we're not missing anything. So you looked at the original document that I added last evening. It's pretty messy. I'm happy to reshare it if you want to work your way through lawyer comments, but I will reshare it once it's a little cleaner, hopefully for your review on June 17th. But again, there's not an urgency with this. It's really more just the management of one contract versus two and making sure everything makes sense for both parties. So our hope is to have it ready for June 17th, and worst case, it will be August that will bring that for final approval. Brett, do you want to speak to the change in funding?
So the change that I'm asking for in funding has to do with mill levy override money. And of course, Monument Academy deserves and has received their proportionate share of funding for the mill levy override. What has been problematic for the district at the district level is that we have not tied those funds to the receipt of the funds. So we've been pre-funding from the district level, Monument Academies and mill levy override receipts. And so what I'm asking to do is create a pattern that really ties to when we receive the funds so that at the district level, we're not carrying fund balance solely for the purpose of funding Monument Academy's MLO.
That was my exact question
Yeah.
for this section. And does that also include essentially the float money for the trough?
So that still
Or
is in
will that go
existence.
away?
That still is there. And so, so it's separate but similar issue is how we remit School Finance Act money to Monument Academy. And, it's been tradition that school districts fund charter schools on an equal amount per month of total school finance money, and have been an equal amount per month on mill levy override money. And so the cash flow always was borne by the back of the school district. And so I've been looking to moderate that. And so I did not pursue the School Finance Act issue, choosing to focus on the mill levy override portion first. So the School Finance Act funding cash flow issue still is there, and that still costs the district about $2 million of cash flow of fund balance at the beginning of the year that we are.
So that is significant, that an amount of money that is not being utilized for the students it was intended to be utilized for, ultimately, at the end of the day. So here's my question. How do we do the art of the and versus the or? Is that money critical to Monument Academy? They represent roughly 17 or 18% of our community students at this juncture. So what if that money went away and was funded in the way it was received, would there be a negative impact to Monument Academy and our 18% of our community students?
There would be if we did it on an immediate change scenario, and so I think
A revolution versus an evolution.
yeah. So we need to work towards the evolution of that.
Okay.
And it'd be a substantial change to the current contract, which is not our intent at this time, but moving forward with whenever we would renew the contract, and also if we were to have a new charter school contract, it would be something that we would want to consider.
So I would like to ask the board consider making that migration in spirit of us utilizing all our tax dollars for what they were intended to be done, and to do so with a keen eye towards not creating pain for Monument Academy, but getting everything on footing of integrity.
I appreciate that, and I agree with that, and that's exactly why I took the mill levy override as the first step, kind of the example of the larger issue.
Yep.
Yep.
And is Mr. Gustafson still engaged in the finances?
He is, and he's presented that particular scenario to Ryan Graham, their president, and so Ryan understands it and concedes to that point with the MLO.
Okay. And can then we as a board ask that you do the same thing with Mr. Gustafson to create an evolutionary process that's unpainful for our students and staff at Monument Academy, but that it enables us to utilize that float money for its intended purposes?
Yes, I can continue that conversation with him.
Yeah, that would be a conversation to be continued, and when we ultimately vote, that's when we would look at that. But absolutely, I don't think it's anybody's intention, and I think we would vehemently push back on anything that would cause undue harm and strain to Monument Academy, making sure that we're taking care of our kids they're all of our kids, right? They're all of our students. So that's what I think that you were saying is.
Yeah.
And hopefully, ultimately, it's good for them too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And to your point, Amber, as far as the contract, when I started looking at it and I started seeing how the different comments on it, having a clean version for us to look through, I think makes sense. I don't see any need to do an unnecessary work. That's my own personal preference, is when all the cards are on the table and it's laid out and everybody's amicable and it makes sense, then we have a clean copy and a clean version to look at, to discuss and vote on. And I think we are indeed, of course, working with Mr. Gustafson and Mr. Graham and their team as well. And thank you so much, Brett, there's some foresight there too of making sure that we're taking care of that they're able to take care of their students in their building and we're taking care of our students in our building, and that the dollars are being efficiently and effectively used and shared, and it benefits everyone.
And so if I could I would we have Jalinda here. I don't know if you guys know Jalinda here in the audience.
Yes.
She's on the MA board.
Yep.
And also a member of the FTC, so a great partner in this. And so appreciate that you're here and hearing your conversation.
I didn't even see you back there. Welcome. Okay. Any other discussion or questions, thoughts? Great. Okay. Let's just make sure that we are continuing a good, strong partnership. That's our last one before we adjourn is B5, Charter School Application Review Process. So as everyone knows, there is an application that has been put in for a new charter school here in D38. And so, Amber, would you like to walk us through this?
I would. My intent for this presentation is to give you an overview of the work we're currently engaged in and then the proposed timeline moving forward and kind of what the process will look like as we review this application. So the application that we received is World Compass Academy. It is a kindergarten through 8th grade charter school focused on introducing students to different world languages. Once we receive the application, we have a process for reviewing the components, which we have done. We received the application on April 29th. We spent some time reviewing the application for completeness. We recognized that there were some components that were not included or were incomplete, and we notified the school of those components and then received the additional materials May 29th. I'll talk to you about the timeline, how we're going to develop a review committee, and then what those next steps are. And always beginning with our district vision, mission, and priorities, as well as values. And the application review process will align with our district mission, which you see here in its entirety. And essentially our process will be to review the application to ensure that it supports our district mission and that we are upholding our expectations for quality options for our students and our community should we recommend this school to become part of our district portfolio. So when a charter applicant looks to a district for a potential partnership, the first step is a letter of intent to submit an application, which we did receive well before the 30-day requirement. They also submitted their application on time, and then, as I mentioned, we reviewed the application for completeness, and we are going to begin the initial application review, which we have not yet started. After we develop that review team, and that will include, as you see in the policies that I've attached in board docs, we must include the DAC, or in our case, our PCAC and our FTC in that review process. So we've already been notifying them as of this past spring of the potential of us receiving this application, and I'll shortly be reaching out to those who expressed interest as well as others to give them an opportunity to participate in the review process. We'll also have many members of our administrative team reviewing specific parts of the application related to their areas of expertise. So as an example, Ms. Holmes will be very influential in reviewing all of the components of special education, and Ms. Welch will be reviewing all of the components related to human resources.
I have a question. So we just talked about the value in our partnership with Monument Academy, and with Monument Academy being our only charter school currently in D38. They will also have an opportunity and be a part of this as well, right?
We are required to include a charter school parent, at least one, if we have a charter school in place in the district. And we are also required to include someone with charter school expertise. And we know we have folks on our PCAC and FTC, as we just mentioned, that will likely be interested in participating in the process.
I just wanted to make sure that Monument Academy had an opportunity to be weighing in on this discussion as well.
So after we review the application, there'll be a scoring rubric that we'll use to ultimately provide recommendations to the entire PCAC and then ultimately the board. As part of that process, if we have questions, we'll seek clarification from the applicant. And there'll also be a process which we call a capacity interview, where we will interview the applicant in person and ask clarifying questions related to the materials that they have provided. Finally, there'll be a final recommendation report and presentation to the PCAC and the Board of Education. We're also required to host geographic meetings so that the community can come and hear from the applicant about how it would impact their students or our community.
Mr. Schwartz.
Sorry.
Can you do that again in 10?
Say jinx,
You
Banyako.
weren't quite synced. What are the dates and timeframes around these steps?
We
Question
are working on that. So I'll skip ahead. By policy, our policy is somewhat unclear, and so we'll likely be bringing forward revisions to our policy on charter school partnerships sometime this fall to winter as well. It is in alignment with the law, but it doesn't specify school days, work days versus calendar days, so there is some ambiguity in our current policy for what those timelines entail. But the World Compass Academy folks have been very easy to work with, and since they are planning to open in school year 2026-27, we are planning an extended timeline from the 90-day specification that's currently in our policy, and we believe that they'll be flexible with that timeline. So this is what we're looking at as a tentative timeline, doing the review process throughout the summer with then a vote by the board, likely August, potentially September.
Wow. That's quick. That's coming up quick.
This would be extended from the 90 days that's currently within our policy. So again, it's not specific as to calendar days versus business days. And in the law itself, it gives a provision that some of this would be extended if school wasn't in session or if there were federal holidays. But again, I do believe the applicant will be able to work out a specific timeline with them.
Second half of my question. Thank you. What does the law require us to do? And where do we have discretion?
So these are the components that we need to review. These are all of the components that the applicant has submitted within their application. And essentially, we need to review the application and we look at it for the quality of the application as well as considering the need within our community. And then, as I mentioned, we must include input from the PCAC. We must include charter school representation, and then we must make a recommendation to the board. So then the board will vote on whether or not to accept the school as a partner moving forward. Also, in my experience, the board is able to put in some conditions with that approval should you decide to approve the application. Many times it has to do with confirmed enrollments and viability financially of the school to thrive. And I
was
don't
gonna
know,
ask that.
Brett, if you want to add anything regarding that.
Mr. Brown.
I was just going to ask about that specifically. At this point, we don't know what their intended capacity would be yet.
We do. It is in their application, and it is a fairly large traditional size kindergarten through 8th grade school. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but I think it was around 550 students to start.
To start, yeah, and they were going to start with just a K-6 population and then add 7 and 8. So I think their steady state, if you will, was going to get up towards 700.
Okay.
This was their plan.
What's that part?
To your point, Tanae, about this being quick, you know, the state process is really designed as kind of a 15 to 18 month scenario to help schools open, you know, have enough planning window, but still open relatively soon, right? So this timeline really is designed to facilitate a fall of 25, but as we said, they're actually pointing towards fall of 26. But then they want that extra time to make sure that they have enrollment because they would be needing to build a facility, and that's a big expense to get into, and so they would want to have a lot of assurances themselves that this is something that they should pursue.
Question real quick. On their application, I can't recall, do they already have an identified facility, or is that something that we should discuss later as we're reviewing?
We'll discuss it later. They are considering options currently.
Okay.
Yeah, the other thing I would say to Ron, your question is as the authorizer, the charter school authorizer, we are required to review the application and provide feedback in a very objective manner. And so our final decision needs to be a very objectively defined decision. It won't be an acceptable result to say we don't want this. You know, there has to be why. And has to be really objective because the enabling statutes here are very favorable towards a charter school group, you know, getting a school going. And so even if we were to make a determination of no, they have every opportunity to appeal that to State Board of Education, and State Board of Education generally grants that appeal. So it's what we really need to do is be working with them right from the start and having eyes wide open conversations about what the challenges will be and then what the benefits can be to the community as well.
And we do have objective criteria that we are using to review the application, and all of the folks involved will have specific training on how to use that criteria as they're doing their review. So our next steps shortly, likely this week, we'll be beginning to identify the review team and then determining a timeline with the applicant. We're planning to meet with the applicant on June 17th. That is when Dr. Dattery is next available to be part of that discussion. And so we'll be meeting with their team to decide on those specific timelines for our review completion, for their community meetings, and then for the board to review the application for a vote as well. What other questions can we answer for you?
Anyone else have any questions up to this point? Lots of questions, just can't put them out right now, right? This is new for me. This is going to be an interesting and new learning experience. Personally, I support and appreciate choice in education, and so I'm looking forward to going through the process and learning from it and seeing what comes about.
Agree.
Okay, if there's no more questions, then we will move along. And again, this is another item of more to come. Stay tuned. Well, with that, that is all we have before we move into C1 adjournment. Is there anything else for the good of the order from our fellow board members or team?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay, one of the things I had added that is not on this one is looking at how we can improve our board meeting cadence and participation. And it's not on this agenda because we will be having our board retreat coming up once Dr. Dattery's on the team. So it seemed more appropriate to have that discussion during that time. So we're working together. And then just to give everyone a heads up real quick, some personal issues have come up, and I owe you all some emails that have been continuing to come my way. I just haven't had a chance to share those out. If that's something that's important to you all, if it's not, just want to make sure that I'm being as transparent as possible. So.
I have one last thing. If we've got dates for next year, I'd like to put them on my calendar.
Okay, that's really good. We missed that to put that on here. Can we put that on the regular board meeting coming up? Okay, we'll have that. Yes, you mean for upcoming board meetings, correct?
Yes, please. And a retreat if we've got a date.
Okay, yeah, and that's something we talked about at our last meeting of having future dates in the superintendent update too. So. Anything else for the good of the order? No? All right, well, then we are adjourned at 11:05. And I just want to remind everybody at home that with this meeting, that to view the meeting's presentation documents, you can access Board Docs, and a link to the Board Docs website can be found via the D38 website, which is www.lewispalmer.org. On the Board of Education meeting webpage. So, and with that, we'll see everybody at our upcoming board meeting, which is also June 17th. So we'll see everybody then.
Lots to do.
It's exciting. There's lots to do, and it's exciting work.